So we need to talk about a very important case that was argued in front of the Supreme Court today. This case attempts to build off some prior unanimous rulings by the Supreme Court, which impact our rights to prevent the unlawful and warrantless entries into our homes. So let's talk about what happened today during these oral arguments, and then also what do I think the outcome of this case is going to be. Before we jump into this video, I want to ask you guys that if you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also double check to make sure YouTube is not unsubscribed you because they love to do that. It would also be really cool to try to reach 900,000 subscribers before the end of the year. We're a little bit of ways off, but it'd be cool to try to do that. Again, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is First Form. You guys know that First Form is an amazing company. They have great supplements and also their culture is unmatched. It bleeds into everything that they do. They try to do everything to the highest standard, and they're also pro-freedom, pro-America. They support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel. So if you want to get great supplements and support a great company, check them out using the links down below. And if you order something $100 or more, you can get free shipping, and also they have a money-back guarantee. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a new Supreme Court case that was argued today, and it involves when police can enter someone's home without a warrant. This case tries to use a prior unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court, which involved the warrantless entry into a home. This new challenge pending in front of the Supreme Court and was argued in front of the Supreme Court today is called Case versus Montana. This challenge is important for gun owners to know about because it involves when law enforcement potentially can use some legal workarounds to not only enter your home without a warrant, but also potentially confiscate your firearms as a result of their entry. This case was argued in front of the Supreme Court this morning, and generally, I think that this is potentially going to go in a positive way. I think the ruling of the lower court, the Montana Supreme Court, will be reversed, but there's going to be some nuance in how that happens. Now, this challenge here attempts to expand upon a prior unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court in cases like Caniglia versus Strom, and then also Brigham City versus Stewart. Now, the facts surrounding this case and how it wound up in the Supreme Court is very interesting. Essentially, the individual here, Trevor Case's ex-girlfriend, called police saying that he had called her, that she had a bad feeling, that maybe she heard a firearm being racked, and she said that she heard a pop on the call, but she wasn't absolutely certain about what was happening. When her and police officers arrived at the home of Trevor Case, she told them that she could not exactly remember what he said on the call, but that she had a bad feeling and that he might actually want to have a shootout with the police officers. Apparently, all the police officers knew Trevor Case, and they also knew that he had a history of mental health issues. They also had interactions with him in the past where they were called out to his home and nothing happened. Now, when the police officers arrived at the home, they looked through all the windows, looked into the rooms, and they did not see Trevor Case. Now, one of the officers also noticed an empty holster with no handgun in it, and they also saw a notepad, and they also saw some empty beer cans. The police officers knocked on the front door, shined flashlights through the windows, called for him, but he did not respond. Now, after about 40 minutes at the house, the police officers then decided to enter the home through the unlocked front door. One of the police officers entered an upstairs bedroom where he saw a closet curtain jerk open. He said that he saw Trevor Case's face and also a black object. And that officer decided to shoot at Trevor Case. He shot him once in the arm. It went through the arm and then also hit him in the abdomen. Now, after he was shot, they called for medical aid, and they also recovered a handgun, I believe, in a laundry basket in that upstairs bedroom. Now, the police officer who shot Trevor Case shot him within 0.4 of a second with a single shot. And he also made statements that it was kind of a startled response, that he just saw the closet curtain jerk open, he saw it moving, and so he let one fly. Now, Mr. Case argued in response to this that the officer's warrantless entry into his home violated the Fourth Amendment, so the gun and other evidence should be suppressed. Now, those arguments were ultimately rejected by the lower courts and eventually also rejected by the Montana Supreme Court in a 4-3 split decision. However, in that ruling, the Montana Supreme Court did not use the Brigham City standard, which was outlined by the Supreme Court, but instead they appeared to apply a lower standard of reasonable suspicion or even something lower. Because of that, this challenge has now made its way to the United States Supreme Court, and it was granted review and oral arguments took place this morning. Now, in his petition, Mr. Case argues that the Supreme Court should apply the Fourth Amendment's probable cause rules to these types of emergency aid situations where police officers are entering a home. In this case, both the Trump administration and the state of Montana argue for the probable cause standard to be rejected in these type of emergency aid cases. In fact, the Trump administration asked for this sliding scale style of reasonable suspicion. They want that to be applied because that gives what they argue police officers more wiggle room to help in these types of emergency situations. Now, after listening to the oral arguments this morning, my impression is that this case will really hinge on the fact that the Montana Supreme Court did not properly apply the U.S. Supreme Court's prior unanimous ruling in that Brigham City versus Stewart case. Now, in that case, the Brigham case, police officers responded to a complaint about a loud party. When police officers arrived at that house, they saw that some minors were drinking outside, and they also heard some shouting inside the home. Now, as they were approaching that house, they looked through a window, and they saw that a minor was fighting with 4 adults. One of the adults punched that minor really hard in the face, I believe, and the police officer also saw that minor spit out some blood. Now, the officers announced their presence at the home, but nobody heard them because it was loud inside. There was a party, and they were all fighting, and so they decided to enter the home. They ultimately arrested the men for providing alcohol to the minors and then also assaulting the minor, and this eventually made its way to the courts. Now, in that unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court, they held that the police may enter a building without a warrant when they have an objectively reasonable basis to believe that an occupant is seriously injured or threatened with such injury. Now, in these oral arguments that happened this morning in this case challenge, a lot of the justices focused on the fact that the Montana Supreme Court did not properly apply that standard. Instead, they used a lesser standard of reasonable suspicion or even something looser. In fact, at one point, Justice Barrett mentioned and kind of mocked the Montana Supreme Court for issuing a very sloppy opinion, and she said that it was a very sloppy ruling. It appeared that the majority, if not all of the justices on the Supreme Court, agreed that the Montana Supreme Court got this analysis wrong. The question then becomes, what are they going to do about that improper ruling? Now, many of the justices asked if they should simply vacate and remand the case back down to the Montana Supreme Court and say that they simply need to apply the Brigham City opinion. The other option that they floated out there and asked the counsels about was if they should decide the case themselves and look at the facts of Mr. Case's situation, apply the Brigham City standard, and give guidance to all of the lower courts. I will state that Mr. Case's counsel primarily pushes and focuses on how the Supreme Court should apply the Fourth Amendment probable cause jurisprudence on these types of emergency aid cases. However, I will state I do not think that any of these justices were in favor of doing that. Many had concerns about how hard the probable cause standard would be for police officers to meet and essentially decipher on the fly when they're looking at these type of emergency situations. Many of the conservative justices as well expressed concerns about it potentially preventing police officers from doing their jobs because they don't know how to apply that standard potentially. So ultimately, the question is, what do I think the outcome of this case will be? Well, I think it will lead to 2 potential outcomes. Both will lead to the Supreme Court here reversing what the Montana Supreme Court said in this challenge. First, either the Supreme Court will simply vacate and remand the case back down to the Montana Supreme Court and simply say, apply Brigham City in that opinion. The other option was to simply reverse the case and issue their own ruling, applying the Brigham standard and looking at the facts of this case and doing that to essentially give further guidance to the lower courts on how to rule on these emergency aid cases. That test they will likely apply in this case would be for police officers in determining if they had an objectively reasonable basis to believe that an occupant is seriously injured or threatened with such injury. And again, that is the standard that was outlined in Brigham. And here it seemed like a lot of the justices said that you just simply apply that standard also in this type of fact pattern. So ultimately, I think this will be a unanimous decision vacating what the Montana Supreme Court ruling said. The nuance with that will come in maybe some of the judges writing a concurrence on how they think this should have come out, or some of them saying, no, we just should not simply vacate and remand. If they just decide to vacate and remand, you might have some concurrences saying, yes, we agree that the Montana Supreme Court decision needs to be vacated, but we should have issued our own ruling, and this is how I think the ruling should come out. And then the other option is simply that the court does fully issue their own decision, apply the standard themselves, and give guidance to the lower courts. But with either route, it appears that the result will be that the Montana Supreme Court ruling in this case challenge will be vacated because they did not apply the right standard. The Supreme Court now has an opportunity to clarify or expand upon its prior unanimous rulings on these issues, and this has direct downstream implications on what protections we all have from police officers entering our homes without warrants and using these types of warrant exceptions like emergency aid to potentially get into our homes and then bad things potentially happening as a result. So those are some of the main takeaways from the oral arguments that took place today in the Supreme Court. We're going to be now watching closely to see how the Supreme Court rules on this. They have until the end of their term to issue that ruling. So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to subscribe to the channel. Also, you can check out my website, armscholar.com. Over there, we have a lot for you guys that you can check out. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.